what this interview is about and the product and its distribution?
What is the distribution? I mean, who's the audience? Yeah.
So they will make this interview of probably 40, 50 minutes into a shorter one.
Sure.
And then the audience will be, it's targeted towards Christian scholars in China. But
Okay.
maybe more generally to the Christian audience in China.
Okay.
Okay. So before we start, can you look at one of these cameras and just say your name and can you spell it out for us?
It's George Marsden, Marsden. Okay.
And can you state your profession, your job, your title?
My full title is the Francis A. McEnany Professor of History Emeritus, University of Notre Dame.
Perfect. We're ready whenever you are.
Thank you, Professor Marsden, for your being able to be part of this project.
Thank you.
And as a distinguished church historian and author of over 20 books, and as you said in one of your books, an Augustinian, and many others, and also an advocate for Christian education, among all these or others, what would be the top 3 identity markers that you would like to use to introduce yourself?
I'm probably best known as a historian of American religion, particularly American evangelicalism and fundamentalism. I've also written on the history of religion in higher education in America and been an advocate for relating Christianity to scholarship in whatever field. And then I did a biography of Jonathan Edwards, which is a whole nother topic that I'm known for to some extent.
Okay, thank you. And looking back, what have been the main themes of pursuits in your academic life?
Well, I have had a sense of calling for a long time to try to understand the interactions of Christianity and culture, particularly in American culture, to see how the church got to be the way it is, the influences it's had on the culture, and the ways in which the culture reshapes the church. And so I see myself as having a sort of a mission to the church to say, where have we been and how do we get here, and maybe where things are headed.
Okay, thank you. And when were the most formative times of your intellectual life? Who are the influential figures that have left marks on your thoughts?
Sure. I think early on, I was wrestling with these sorts of issues of the interaction of American religion and culture, partly because I went to a largely secular undergraduate college, and I had a very strong religious upbringing, and so I was trying to relate the two. I went to Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, and they had a wonderful faculty at that time, and some of those people were very helpful. Cornelius Van Til in apologetics, there's certain kinds of insights that I learned from him in understanding how Christianity fit in with intellectual life. And then some people were spiritually inspiring. Edmund Clowney, who taught homiletics when I was there and became a friend, was very helpful to me in sort of a spiritual guide. So I think that's probably the time I was shaped the most. Also, when I first came to Calvin College to teach in the 1960s, there was a wonderful faculty there too, and I had colleagues that helped set the agenda for us working together collectively, not just as an individual thing, and that was very helpful to have people to work with, like Alvin Plantinga, Nicholas Waltersdorf, and quite a few others who were equally helpful.
Okay, thank you. So was it the Tuesday afternoon seminars?
No, not the seminars. Since I'm a historian, I was at some of those seminars sometimes. Actually, I got to know them in 1979. The Calvin Center for Christian Scholarship had a year on faith and reason, and Plantinga and Waltersdorf and a number of other Christian philosophers were there, and I was the token historian in the group, and so I learned a lot of philosophy from them at that time.
Okay, thank you. And as a historian who also lives in the current time, how do you see the needs of our time? And how do your intellectual efforts help to respond to these needs?
I see the strengths and the weaknesses of the church in our time are very closely related. And the Protestant church, and particularly evangelicalism, is very adaptable to all sorts of cultural settings, and that's wonderful, and it's a source of growth and the reason why it can manage in China in very different circumstances from what we have here. But it also leads to a sort of, in this country particularly, a sort of market-driven dimension where whatever works is what people go to, and so rather than having good leadership sort of stepping back and saying, here's where we should be going, we're going where it's easiest to go very often. And so I see partly the role of scholars is to try to get a voice in saying, how can we be more thoughtful in the directions that we're going?
Thank you. One question I have, which can also be stated in many various ways, like what role does your own faith play in doing historical research? Has there ever been tensions between your belief in God's providence or redemption and your historical research? Butterfield has said that historians ought to avoid the weak interpretation of history. How should historical scholars treat the relationship between your faith and historical evidence?
Yes, that's good. I've long thought about and advocated trying to relate my faith to my scholarship, and that's one of the things I learned early on, that it makes sense that everyone has a perspective, and so if you have a Christian perspective, it makes sense to try to relate your Christian perspective to everything that you do, and that doesn't make you any different from someone that has a secular perspective or an ideological based perspective. And then in trying to understand the role of the church in American culture particularly, it's I think important to not be simply partisan. And when Butterfield talks, for instance, about the Whig interpretation of history, what he has in mind is sort of the people who are the winners celebrate all the progress that they've made. But I think it's particularly for Christians who are historians or other kinds of scholars, I think it's good to also show humility about your own tradition and to understand that things often go wrong, that we are humans after all, and we're fallible, and so that the history of God's people, as in the Bible, it's often a history of people doing the wrong the wrong things, and so those who are reflecting on the history can try to tell it the way it is. And then, as far as relationship, understanding God's providence in all that, it seems to me one of the people whom I respect on the topic, Richard Lovelace, who taught at Gordon Conwell Seminary, said that doing Christian history is like looking at a football game where half the players are hidden. And so you know God is acting, but you don't know, all you see is other actors. And you don't know exactly what the interactions between God and these other actors is. And so I mean, I've thought of it as analogous to J.R.R. Tolkien in the Lord of the Rings, that you have the hobbits who, they know we're on a mission. We don't know exactly how it's going to turn out. We're trying to trust people who are better than ourselves, and then maybe some of them ought to be map readers, and I see a historian as something like that. He would say, well, here's where we've been, and maybe this is helpful for where we're going, but we know we're on a mission, but we don't understand everything about it. So again, I think intellectual humility is one of the dimensions of what we should be doing. That has to be matched with some sort of intellectual confidence in being grounded in what you believe. But I think the two are complementary from a Christian perspective, and I think that's one way in which Christian perspectives differ from a lot of ideologically based perspectives, which tend to be absolutist and simply celebrate their own tradition and denigrate everybody else.
Thank you. And has there been any points in life in your research that you feel puzzled or challenged, challenged in your belief in providence, and then how looking at the archives and the history turned out like this? Sure, that it's sometimes puzzling why things go the way they do, particularly if you're thinking, if God has a hand in history, why is it so tangled? And also there's challenges of trying to understand religious conflict between different religions or within religion. Why does that happen? And how? I mean, it's a matter of trying to, again, be grounded in what you believe, but try to be generous to people who disagree with you. But sure, there are. I think for anyone who is thoughtful, you're constantly negotiating with challenges to your faith to some degree. But I think also you can have a confidence that if you trust in God, that's the best you can do, and hope that that's the right thing to be doing. Thank you. And what made you decide to write a biography of Jonathan Edwards among all American theologians? I know in the preface or foreword you mentioned the new archives and new materials came out, but were there any other reasons? Yes, I was long interested in Jonathan Edwards. I grew up in a Reformed Presbyterian background and with a lot of theological emphasis. And then I discovered Jonathan Edwards largely when I was in graduate school, more than when I was in seminary, and he was very highly regarded by the more liberal Christian and even some secular historians just because of his intellectual strength and prowess. And I started reading Edwards, and I found a dynamic of his expression of Christianity as an outgrowth of the love of God as sort of the
the reason why there is a universe at all. The reason we have a universe is it's called the Big Bang of the love of God radiating through reality, and then the center of reality is, do we respond to that love or beauty or not? And that, for me, was helpful theological dynamic that I've been reared on. A lot of doctrine, talking about the sovereignty of God and principles, but Edwards made it come alive in certain ways, and so I was very interested in that, and then the opportunity came to write this biography in honor of his 300th anniversary of his birth, and so that it just fit with my with my interests, and I found it totally fascinating to try to figure out how this person lived in 18th century colonial America, which was sort of the frontier and the Wild West of that time. That it was a time when there was a lot of conflict between the British and the French, and then the Indians who were being displaced, and what all those relationships were made the whole thing quite fascinating.
Thank you. And so, as a noted biographer of Jonathan Edwards, why did you later also become interested in studying C.S. Lewis?
Well, that's a good question. Basically, it was after I was done with Edwards, I was looking around for someone to study who would be equally edifying. That I found working with Edwards every day for quite a few years, that was very helpful to me. There's a lot of integrity. And then the opportunity arose to contribute to a series Princeton Press did called The Lives of Great Religious Books. And it occurred, and they asked me if I wanted to do something, and it occurred to me, well, C.S. Lewis's A Mere Christianity is a book that is still very much a vital book, and it would be very interesting to write about that, and it would be well deserved to be in that series. So I'd never worked on Lewis before, but it was a wonderful opportunity to read everything of Lewis and a lot about Lewis, and be edified just by someone who's a very wise Christian guide, and much more down to earth than Edwards, but a good compliment to Edwards. That Edwards did the high theology, and Lewis thinks about the common sense ways this relates to everyday life.
Okay. It's interesting to me that you seem to enjoy dialoguing with these people.
Yes.
Who you feel they nourish your religious life too.
Yes, and I'm learning from them, and then I see the purpose of particularly the Lewis work is trying to communicate to other Christians what is it in Lewis that's really valuable, and what should they notice, and so if it's edifying for me, then how can I relay that to an audience and communicate that to an audience?
Thank you. And and also your book, The Soul of the American University, was translated into Chinese, and many people are reading it. Not just Christian educators who are interested in pushing forward for Christian college, but many other educators, secular educators. What do you think makes the soul of a modern university?
Well, it's interesting that has happened because as you know, the American style of university was imported to China and had an influence on Chinese education. So the history of the American universities is very relevant to the history of Chinese universities, and the American universities just about all started as fairly traditionally Christian enterprises, and then in the late 19th, early 20th century shifted to becoming more liberal Christian, and then shifted to becoming more secular. And just at the time that that shift was taking place, higher education in China was being shaped by these American models. So the same kind of thing is happening, that you're starting with more traditional Christianity, and by the 1920s or so, it's moved to a very liberal Christianity, or essentially a secular education. So there's a commonality in the shift. What's the soul or the center, and shifting from being very specifically Christian-oriented to being more oriented toward a humanism, and then toward just sort of a broader idea of civilization.
Mm-hmm. And I think Christian educators like to read this book because they want to learn about lessons from the past. And you've written like the outrageous idea of Christian scholarship, and many other talks that you've given were on Christian education. And what would you say to encourage or warn, advise these Christian educators in their cause to push forward for Christian education in China?
Well, I think, one thing is to push back against the prejudice that religious views are backward or out of date, and I think you've interviewed Alvin Plantinga and Waltersdorf and so forth, people who have shown that religious points of view are just as intellectually legitimate as other points of view. So I think there's a strong argument for the legitimacy of Christian scholarship. Then I don't know the Chinese situation. You do need institutions or supporting networks of people to work with, and for me it's been very important to be a lot of my intellectual shaping, as I said, took place at Calvin College and in a community of scholars. And then there's also these days a network that you don't have to be physically in the same place to have a network of like-thinking people that you can support and be supported by. So I think it's very important to build those sorts of networks and organizations and institutions, if you can, to try to build Christian scholarship. And then I think there are also, it's important for all of us these days to see it as an international project, that it's not, it's not, we can learn from Chinese can learn from other people, and there are a lot of, Christianity is a worldwide religion, global Christianity, and there's all sorts of resources to learn from, to see yourself not in just a little parochial group, but you're connected to people all over the world.
Thank you. And you mentioned in many places that because you've taught and advised students in many different institutions like Notre Dame and Duke and Calvin College, but you still very generously said many times that Calvin College you find here very good or the best research environment for Christian scholars. Could you name the reasons?
Well, what I found is that at more secular institutions, you often find yourself going back to basic disagreements that you have with people who just don't agree on anything. And so you're always working from at the very basic level. Whereas at Calvin, you don't have to start at step one. You can start at step 4 or 5, where we agree on a whole bunch of things. And then from there, we can have very sophisticated discussions. What does this imply, or how should we rethink something or other, so that there is a better atmosphere for high-level kind of discussion there. And I think, as I say, I think that's possible these days, you don't even have to be physically in the same place to have that kind of discussion.
Okay, thank you. Great. And one does leave an impact on others and the world in one way or another. So as individuals, we can be remembered this way or that. How would you like to?
That's hard to say. I mean, I would like to be remembered as a good person who served God and a family, and who has, I think, good relationships to students that I've taught, many of whom have become good friends. And then when you write things, you do hope some of those things will be remembered, and other people will pick up I mean, not necessarily remember what you did, but maybe go beyond that, and that I think that's reassuring if you're a professor, and then you can look at, there are other generations of people coming up that are, things are in good hands, and will continue to, in the sorts of directions that you're hoping things will go in.
Okay, thank you. What would you say to a young generation of maybe Chinese scholars, like Christian historians, future Christian historians, or Christian scholars in China?
I don't know the situation in China as well, but I think there's a need for historians of China's, Christianity in China, and as you well know and exemplify, there is a remarkable history of Christianity in China, and to figure out how that all happened in relation to the Chinese situation, and what makes the Chinese Christianity unique, and what needs to be done, and how do you understand different manifestations of it. All those things are tasks that scholars can pick up, and so it's a different cultural situation than I've experienced, but it's the same kinds of question. How's God working in this peculiar cultural setting, and in sometimes very troubling times, but there are you need some people who step back and take and have some perspective to offer to everybody.
Thank you. And lastly, could you please share a Bible passage with them, the audience, or Christian scholars in China?
Sure. Psalm 103 is my favorite psalm, and I think the part that I think of the most is I'm sure I can recite it all, but as high as the heavens above the earth, so great, or is God's love as far as the east is from the west, so far as He removed our sins from us, like as a father pities a child, so He pities us, and He remembers our fame. He remembers that we're dust, and then that life of man is like the grass and the flower of the field. The wind blows and place knows it no more, but the mercy of the Lord is forever.
Thank you. Prayer? Yeah, I don't know. More questions? Yeah, in general. So Pastor Jerry has a general question about the role of missionaries in shaping the world. It's very general.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to, first of all, admire people who are willing to go to other parts of the world to be missionaries, and then, as you know, the impact on other cultures is sometimes a mix, and I think that's probably always been an issue in Chinese culture, that you have a very sophisticated culture, and then you have Westerners who came there thinking, okay, we can improve these people, and I think the one thing I know about history of missions is the better people are the missionaries are at some point stepping back and putting it in the hands of the people, the people on the scene, and the native people who are native to the region. The better missions go, and maybe China's an interesting case of that, because the missionaries were forced to leave. It put everything in the Chinese hands, and that has something to do with successes. But I'm not an expert on missions, but it's an interesting. It's always an interesting topic.
Thank you.
For Chinese churches, right now they have pretty much like sent out missionaries.
Mm-hmm.
So, what's your opinion and advice for that? When Chinese church like to be part of the role that like send out missionaries.
When China becomes a mission-sending country,
Yeah.
what would be your advice?
Well, I think these days, it may be because missions is such, much more international thing than it was 100 years ago, when it was mostly west, going west to the rest of the world, and now the West is a minority of Christians, and the rest of the world is the majority, and so there can be interchanges among other parts of the world without so much of that sort of the tinge of imperialism. So I guess that's a good that's a good thing, and of course we have so much more mobility today that there is opportunity for bringing missions to people from different countries who moved to, Chinese in North America. You can bring Chinese missionaries to witness to them. Anyway, yeah, I'm not, but it's not a topic I'm really an expert on. Dear Lord, we thank you that all things are in your hands. We sometimes are mystified by the way things develop in the world and in history, but we thank you that you have taken on human frailties and human suffering unto yourself, and that you share in those and give us hope that the whole world may see your love. In Christ's name we pray.